Welcome back to MAFIA, and in this Audio Boom original podcast series, we explore America's criminal underworld to reveal the lives and careers of its greatest gangsters. Our sponsors for this episode are Hims, ZipRecruiter, and Dollar Shave Club. This series has been extensively researched and produced in consultation with experts, authors, and those who were actually there.
Previously on MAFIA.
Schultz is just too much of a hothead and has too much pride in a way to sort of give in to any of Vincent Coll's demands. And he just doesn't have that sort of compromising gene that people like Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano has.
1931 New York. The city is in the midst of one of the bloodiest gang wars in its history. A war between Dutch Schultz, the so-called beer baron of the Bronx, and his most violent associate, Vincent Mad Dog Coll. It was exactly the kind of open warfare that Lucky Luciano had been trying to end when he organized the mob in 1929.
Luciano realized if you could do it non-violently and get away with it, it was a lot better than doing it violently. Then in the long run, too much violence brought too much attention from law enforcement, and that could be your undoing.
Public violence was something that gangsters at this time were starting to abhor, that they were perfectly happy with little private acts of violence or, something happening in a back alley, but shooting it out on the street in broad daylight was bad for business. It got a lot of bad publicity, and police, even if they were in the pay of the local gangsters, kind of felt obliged to do something about it, and politicians were under a lot of pressure to do something about it. So other gangsters were quite appalled by this war between Dutch Schultz and Vincent Coll, especially that it seemed kind of pointless in a way because Schultz probably could have come up with a much more peaceful solution other than sort of engaging in fights with machine guns on the street.
This is MAFIA. As long as only rival gang members were being hurt, the war was tolerated. But the situation changed quickly when the violence spread. Author Nate Hendley has researched the life and times of Dutch Schultz in depth.
It's war, it's very violent, even by New York gangster standards. It's just, hell on the streets. And both sides are not willing to negotiate. They're just shooting at each other. And that led into the horrific incident in which Vincent Coll and his gangsters shot up a bunch of children by trying to hit one of Dutch Schultz's associates on the street.
4 children were hit. 5-year-old Michael Vengali later died in the hospital.
The newspapers are starting to pay a lot of attention to Dutch Schultz, that all of a sudden, he's rising from this sort of obscure thug in the Bronx. He's sort of getting a reputation in the media, and he's starting to attract the eye of the police. He's starting to attract the eye of politicians. He's not quite on the radar as Lucky Luciano is. He's not quite on the radar as Al Capone is in Chicago, but this is really starting to raise his profile in a very dangerous way. And you've got people who are coming into power like Mayor LaGuardia, who would become mayor a couple years after the war, and he really wants to clean up the city, and he really targets people like Dutch Schultz. So he's gaining a reputation. And in a lot of ways, it's a very negative reputation because he's getting attention from police, from politicians, from the press. And a good gangster doesn't want that. You want to be sort of in the background, managing things. You don't want to get your name in the paper, and you don't want prosecutors and police sort of looking over your shoulder.
The war finally came to a bloody end. Schultz's men tracked Coll down and trapped him in a phone booth, where they opened fire. But it was a short-lived victory. Schultz and the mob were now the ones in the firing line, having drawn the attention of the new and ambitious chief assistant attorney, Thomas Dewey.
He has a mustache, he's very clean-cut looking, and he carries himself with certain dignity. Thomas Dewey is almost the exact opposite of Dutch Schultz. Other than the fact that they were born in the same year, they have almost nothing in common. That Schultz is about, as bad as you can get, and Thomas Dewey is about as good as you can get. He's almost a stereotypical straight arrow. Great student at school, great marks, becomes a prosecutor. He's very straight arrow, married, children, definitely sort of got passion for the law, passion against crime, and he's very serious and he's very incorruptible. That's one of the distinguishing factors, that he can't be bribed. He has a visceral dislike of organized crime.
Dewey wanted to publicly take down a big-time gangster.
Dutch Schultz was wild. He was highly public.
Author Eric Desenhall.
He was seen in night spots like the Cotton Club. He was flashy in a repulsive way, and it made him an easy target.
After the break.
66% of men lose their hair by age 35, and I know some of those guys. They waited a little bit too late to start doing something about that receding hairline. Some of them tried weird solutions or over-the-counter supplements. None of it worked, and they were a little too embarrassed to go to the doctor and get some real medical help. Well, that doesn't have to be your story. Thanks to 4hims.com, a one-stop shop for hair loss, skincare, and sexual wellness for men. Hims connects you with real doctors and medical-grade solutions to treat hair loss. No snake oil pills, no gas station counter supplements. Prescription solutions backed by science. And no embarrassing or awkward visits to the doctor's office. Just go to 4hims.com, answer a few quick questions, and a doctor will review and prescribe you. The products are shipped directly to your door. Order now. Mafia listeners get a trial month of Hims for just $5 today, right now, while supplies last. See website for full details. This would cost hundreds if you went to the doctor or a pharmacy. Go to 4hims.com/mafia. That's FORHIMS.com/MAFIA. 4hims.com/mafia.
After the high-profile humiliation of Chicago mob boss Al Capone on tax evasion charges, Dewey went after Schultz's business records.
Thomas Dewey goes after Schultz's tax affairs simply because it's an effective way of getting gangsters behind bars. To step back for a sec, in the late 1920s, the Supreme Court of the United States rules that you have to declare all income on your income taxes, even if it's gained from illicit sources. It doesn't matter if it's illegal income, you have to declare it. So this becomes a hugely potent weapon for the federal government to use against gangsters. In 1931, this tactic puts Al Capone behind bars for 11 years. Al Capone was never successfully prosecuted for murder, never successfully prosecuted for bootlegging. He is successfully prosecuted for not paying his taxes. So authorities thought, okay, we've got Al Capone, who's the biggest gangster in Chicago. Let's go after one of the biggest gangsters in New York City using the same tactics. So they uncover these ledgers. They find, evidence that Dutch Schultz has had a very high income, and they're very confident that they can nail him on the same charges. So that is why the tactic is used against him, as opposed to trying to charge Schultz with, murder or something more obvious.
Schultz had been a scrupulous bookkeeper, designed to spot any pilfering by his gang. But now it lit up Dutch's criminal enterprise like Broadway. In January 1933, Dutch Schultz was indicted for tax evasion. He faced a massive 43 years in prison if found guilty. His back against the wall, Schultz used a tactic straight out of Arnold Rothstein's book, the mentor he'd come to hate: the big bribe.
Schultz, for once, acts rationally, that he does send one of his minions to Washington to try to sort of sort things out and implicitly offer a bit of a bribe, that he says, well, if I owe $93,000 in income tax, why don't I just pay $100,000 and, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And this is turned down cold. And Schultz is genuinely surprised by this because, in his experience, almost every politician he's encountered can be bribed.
When the bribe didn't work, Schultz went on the run. And after nearly 2 years in hiding, the government declared Schultz public enemy number 1. But now that he was the FBI's top priority, Schultz surprised everyone.
So then he does another thing that is a bit out of character. After he goes into hiding for a while, he turns himself in. That he says, I think I'll have a better shot at trial than if I try to go into hiding. And if he goes into hiding, he runs the risk of, number 1, looking weak, and number 2, other gangsters taking over his territory and his empire. So he throws all caution to the wind and voluntarily turns himself in to be charged, which is quite an unusual step for any gangster to make, much less a gangster as sort of irrational and erratic as Dutch Schultz.
Everyone, even his own gang members, thought Dutch's days were numbered.
Schultz is under enormous stress at this point and is feeling beleaguered on all sides. He's feeling beleaguered. He's feeling pressure from both legal authorities for his taxes and for Thomas Dewey, and he's feeling pressure from the underworld that he knows that his peers will happily take over his territory and his empire if given the chance. So he's feeling paranoid, but he has actually a reason to feel paranoid. But it's a case, of the cliche that a cornered animal is often the most dangerous, that a lot of people think that he's on his way out, no big deal. But Schultz is very cunning, he wants to fight back, and he's not going to give in. So even though he surrenders himself to authorities, this is not a sign that he's giving up. And he's going to fight this to the bitter end, and he's happy to take on his own perceived internal enemies at the same time.
After a persuasive argument by his lawyers, a few days later, Dutch was out, but on a massive $75,000 bail. Determined to shore up his crumbling empire, he called a meeting with his close lieutenant, Jules Martin.
Jules Martin was one of Schultz's associates, and by this point had been working with him closely for several years. Jules was primarily in charge of Schultz's restaurant rackets, which is basically where they would threaten restaurants to join a quote-unquote association, and in exchange, they wouldn't have their place vandalized. So it was obvious, it was just a protection racket, is basically what it was. Jules Martin was in charge of this, and Schultz began to sense that Jules was ripping him off, was, taking money, embezzling money from the organization. He came up with a figure of $70,000. So Schultz arranges a meeting with Jules at a hotel, and they both drink quite a bit. And Schultz at first tries a little bit of diplomacy, which is a bit unusual for Schultz, and sort of, hey, there's some, accusations about you, let's talk about this. And eventually he just gets fed up because Jules is denying everything. Oh, well, I would never, rip you off. What are you talking about? But he does not react very well at all when his personal associates sort of turn on him. He takes this personally, and he takes this revenge personally. So Schultz eventually just reaches over and slaps his, old associate in the face. And this kind of jolts Jules, and he finally admits, well, yes, I did embezzle some money, but he said it was only $20,000. It wasn't 70. And keep in mind, these are at the time, much bigger figures.
Even with the police and press watching his every step, Dutch couldn't keep a lid on his anger.
So Schultz's reaction is he needs the money at the time because he's going on trial for tax evasion. So according to his lawyer, Dixie Davis, who was in the room at the time, Schultz pulled out a gun, put it in Jules' mouth, and pulled the trigger. In his autobiography, Dixie Davis later wrote that Dutch Schultz killed Jules as casually as if he was picking his teeth.
Even for Schultz, this was reckless.
Usually a top-ranking gangster would have one of their underlings, take out Jules in a very sort of quiet, secretive way, in a back alley or something, or somewhere where people might not be listening or might not be watching. So the fact Schultz reacts violently and reacts with personal violence is quite unusual. Jules is killed on the spot, and Schultz's minions evidently take care of the body. This, according to Dixie Davis, was a sign of Schultz's degeneration, that he's, killing somebody in front of a witness. He's doing this crime himself. He's losing control of his ability to, rein in his anger or, have something done rationally. Instead of having one of his, hitmen take out Jules in a nice, quiet way, he runs the risk of arrest, shooting him in a hotel. There could have been other witnesses. Schultz gets away with it, but this is a sign that, he's slipping again. And again, people are only ripping him off because they think he's on his way out.
But Nate Hindley believes it's also the personal betrayal that causes Schultz to lose control.
Schultz reacts incredibly violently with Jules Martin for a couple reasons. Number one, obviously there's the money issue, that Schultz is notoriously tight with his money and is furious because he needs money right now, and here is one of his close associates embezzling. But he also reacts because he doesn't like personal rejection. And you could trace that all the way back to his father living when he was 14, but he does not react very well at all when his personal associates sort of turn on him. He takes this personally, and he takes this revenge personally. It is a danger to be a friend of Dutch Schultz and to double cross him. That if you're friends with Schultz and you're obsequious to him and obey everything he says, you're probably fine. But if you show the slightest sign of disagreeing with Schultz, your life is probably in a lot of danger, even if you've been a close friend, even if you've been working with him for years.
There's more to the story after the break.
Hey, Mafia listeners. Are you looking for someone to do a special kind of job that requires a special skill set? Well, ZipRecruiter might be the place where you find the right candidates. Every business, even a family business, could use a better way to find the right candidates. Something better than posting your job online and just praying for the right people to see it. Well, ZipRecruiter knew there was a smarter way, so they built a platform that finds the right job candidates for you. ZipRecruiter learns what you're looking for, identifies people with the right experience, and invites them to apply to your job. In fact, 80% of employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site in just one day. The right candidates are out there. ZipRecruiter is how you find them. Right now, by listening, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, for free. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/mafia. That's ZipRecruiter.com/MAFIA. ZipRecruiter.com/mafia. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
In July 1935, the trial of Dutch Schultz began. After Dutch's lawyers argued that their client would not receive a fair trial in New York, the judge agreed to move the legal proceedings to a small town near the Canadian border.
Schultz is put on trial in Malone, New York, which is a small town sort of in rural New York State, for tax evasion. And he does something quite out of character for himself, that he shows up in town a week before the trial and puts on what I describe as a charm offensive. He throws money around, and this is really out of character for Dutch Schultz. Takes people out for dinner, he pays their tabs in bars, he goes out to baseball games with the mayor, he becomes friends with everybody,
Dutch Schultz learned enough from Luciano to do something very smart when he was on trial.
Eric Desenhall.
He went to upstate New York and he bought the town. He began to bribe people. He began to try to be charming, and it actually worked. He ended up becoming quite popular, even though the word notorious is probably better. He became a part of the community, and he actually prospered by doing that.
When it goes to trial, he's smart enough to hire a local lawyer. And Schultz really tries to portray himself as a put-upon businessman who is being, screwed over by the big government for his taxes. Something that, the people of Malone could relate to. The little guy being sort of taken on by big bad government. And they weren't, probably not all that concerned with bootlegging.
Schultz was showing surprising cunning, far more in line with his gangland nemesis, Luciano.
So this is Schultz at his most clever. Throwing money around, which is very out of character for him, and being charming. And it also shows if he wanted to be, Schultz could be a very charming, ingratiating guy. Good conversationalist, a lot of fun to be with, life of the party kind of guy. Other times, not so much.
The question was, would it work?
Well, virtually everybody thinks Schultz is going to lose. And, prosecutors are sort of confident, well, we finally got the guy. And Schultz's peers, from Lucky Luciano and even to his own associates like Bo Weinberg, were, suspecting Schultz was going down. And so the gangsters in New York City were all already eyeing Schultz's quite impressive empire, especially his numbers racket. And were sort of, hungrily sort of rubbing their hands saying, I want this share and I want this share and I want this share.
Incredibly, Schultz's bribes and uncharacteristic charm offensive paid off. The jury found him not guilty.
The charm offensive was extremely successful, and the end result was that Schultz got off on his trial, that he was not found guilty, that the system at the time required a consensus vote to find him guilty. They were not able to achieve that, so his case was tossed out.
Schultz was genuinely surprised by his victory, and the small-town judge was appalled.
And the judge of the case was just infuriated and actually gave a little speech in the courtroom saying, basically implying that, out-of-town people have come here and tried to impress the locals and this is terrible, and, basically scolds the jury.
Author Thomas Repetto.
The judge ruled later that those folks could never serve on another jury. He said this decision is against the evidence.
Dutch had beaten the government rap for tax evasion, but on his return to New York, Schultz discovered that other forces had also been conspiring against him.
Schultz has won in Malone, but he quickly realizes that he's been betrayed by one of his closest associates, Bo Weinberg, who's been with him for years.
With Schultz on the ropes, Weinberg had been plotting to betray him to his arch-rival, Lucky Luciano.
Lucky Luciano, he was in communication with a guy named Longy Zwilman and was sort of communicating with them and basically saying, I'll help you take over Dutch Schultz's criminal empire if you give me either a chunk of the proceeds or let me run part of the empire myself. So Bo was thinking very much that Schultz was either going to go to jail or get killed, and much to his, big surprise, Schultz survived.
To Schultz, it was the ultimate betrayal, and once again, he lost control.
When Schultz suspects that Bo Weinberg has turned traitor, this is a perfect example of Schultz's impulsivity over sort of thinking ahead, thinking logically. At this moment, there's an enormous amount of press attention on Dutch Schultz. The police are breathing down his neck. Prosecutors are breathing down his neck. Thomas Dewey is watching him very closely. So what does Schultz do? He says, well, let's just kill Bo Weinberg.
He liked to torture his victims and watch them while they died.
Author of 5 Families, Selwyn Radd.
So he got this idea that he would encase Bo Weinberg's feet in concrete and dump him into the Harlem River.
According to legend, he took him out on a boat, encased his feet in quick-drying cement, tossed him over the side. Whether or not that's true, Bo Weinberg disappeared off the face of the earth. It's widely assumed Schultz killed him. And this is a good example of how, number one, Schultz treats even his close associates and close friends that he thinks have double-crossed him, and that he's willing to commit these incredible acts of violence even with all this attention on him, that he's not thinking logically and thinking, well, maybe it's a bad idea to, commit such a high-profile killing with all this attention. He just throws it to the wind and says, screw it, I'm just going to kill this guy. He screwed me around. He's dead.
He didn't stop there. After the break.
Okay, guys. When it comes to buying razors, I have 2 problems. Number 1, the cost. It's crazy expensive. And number 2, finding the right cartridge for the blade that I bought 5 months ago. And in fact, I have a third problem too, and that's remembering to buy the razors in the first place. On a long grocery list, it's usually at the bottom, if it's on the list at all. But I don't have these problems anymore thanks to Dollar Shave Club. Now, I'm talking about razors, but Dollar Shave Club has a lot more than that. They've got shave butter, shampoo, body wash, toothpaste, everything. Dollar Shave Club has high-quality products at a great price. Their Dr. Carver's shave butter is fantastic. It goes on clear so I can see exactly where I'm shaving. And since DSC delivers, I don't have to hassle with setting foot in a store and wandering the aisles aimlessly. Join Dollar Shave Club today, and for just $5 with free shipping, you'll get the 6-blade Executive Razor, plus trial sizes of shave butter, body cleanser, and 1-wipe Charlies. Then keep the blades coming for a few bucks each month. Get yours at dollarshaveclub.com/mob. That's dollarshaveclub.com/MOB.
One by one, Schultz murdered his close friends in an attempt to remain in power. And other gangland bosses were becoming increasingly concerned by his behavior.
Schultz is, at this point, getting even more erratic, more impulsive, and more bizarre. He's considering converting to Catholicism is another thing. He's suddenly become religious. that he's been a non-practicing Jew all his life, and he suddenly decides that I'm going to become Catholic, and he starts investigating that. His peers are getting very nervous because they think this is another sign of his eccentricity, and they're also a little worried that if he embraces Catholicism, will that mean that he starts confessing to things, Well, hey, police, I've got to tell you this story about some killings I did. So they're getting very nervous about Schultz already, even before he sets his sights on Thomas Dewey. So Schultz is starting to get, even more bizarre than he's been in years prior.
Dutch was now on his own, threatened not only by rival gangland bosses, but also prosecutor Thomas Dewey.
Dewey had his finger pointing at Schultz, and Schultz found out about it, and that turned him into a paranoid, that he knew if Dewey was after him, he might get him. And Dutch Schultz's answer to everything was bloodshed.
Schultz wanted to take out Thomas Dewey. If successful, it would be the highest profile mob hit ever. But first, he'd need the approval of Lucky Luciano and his recently created commission.
The commission is sort of, imagine it as a board of directors for organized crime in America, but it's basically run by Lucky Luciano and some very close allies, sort of to, make decisions and make approvals for assassinations. One of the unwritten rules the commission had was that if you were going to assassinate a very high-level person, be it a politician, a judge, a lawyer, prosecutor, even a journalist, you would have to get their approval. This was not because they were very, pacifists and didn't, had hesitations about killing. Dutch Schultz meets with the commission and requests their approval to assassinate Thomas Dewey. But any kind of killing of that nature would bring a huge amount of pressure onto organized crime. If, for example, you murdered a policeman, all of that policeman's buddies could be assured to sort of jump on your, rackets and jump on your organization. So there was a lot of hesitancy about murdering a prosecutor, even though this prosecutor was dead set on putting them all in jail. So when Schultz approaches them with this idea, they're all very nervous. And Luciano's reaction is basically, well, let's talk about it and we'll see if it's feasible. Then we'll come to a decision about whether we should actually do it or not.
Luciano had no intention of allowing Schultz to kill Dewey, but he realized that his former stablemate was too hot-headed to brush off. So Luciano humored Schultz and commissioned the mob's top hitman, Albert Anastasia, to scope out a hit on Dewey.
Albert Anastasia is one of the leading assassins in something called Murder Incorporated, which is kind of the enforcement arm of the commission. They're the ones who actually carry out the hits that are ordered by the commission. And Albert Anastasia is actually a very clever hitman, and he comes up with the idea that he's going to keep an eye on Thomas Dewey. And to do this, he sort of recruits some little child, probably one of the son of a gangster, puts him on a tricycle and has him sort of bike up and down the sidewalk in front of Thomas Dewey's house in New York City. So anybody looking on would assume that Albert was just sort of a, doting father, spending some quality time with his son before work. Thomas Dewey certainly doesn't notice. So Albert sort of tracks his movements, figures out when he leaves the house, how many bodyguards he has, where he goes, and without too much, hassle from his bodyguards or anything. So Albert makes this report back to the commission saying it's entirely feasible to kill Thomas Dewey. It's up to you to decide whether or not you want to actually have me do it.
Dutch thought he'd got the go-ahead.
Well, Schultz is initially delighted to hear this report from Albert Anastasia saying, well, here's a way we could actually kill Thomas Dewey. He's thinking, great, we can get this guy off my back.
But then, as Thomas Repetto explains, Luciano talked to the other bosses.
And that Luciano said, if he kills Dewey, he'll bring the whole world down around our ears. The whole world will drop on us here. We can't let him do that.
Schultz was desperate to knock Dewey out, but the decision rested in the hands of his nemesis, Lucky Luciano.
And the commission at this point is incredibly worried. They would love Thomas Dewey to die, but they don't want to have one of their own kill him for all the reasons I mentioned. It would bring a huge amount of negative publicity on the organized crime and bring a lot of unwanted attention from police and authorities.
Lucky delivered the commission's final verdict, a firm no.
Schultz is appalled, and he feels again a sense of betrayal. Schultz just completely loses his temper, basically loses his mind, and says, I don't care what the commission has to say. I don't care what Lucky Luciano has to say. I'm going to do this myself. So their reaction is more a shock and astonishment than anything else, because they're used to sort of sitting around and, at least having a pretense of, gentility and sort of discussing things. And all of a sudden, this guy's acting like the street corner thug that he's been all his life. So this is, quite unusual, and they're very surprised that anyone would disagree with one of their, pronouncements, because, that essentially means Dutch Schultz has signed his death warrant. So the initial reaction of the commission is just shock and surprise. And then after Schultz departs, it quickly becomes, fear and loathing, that they realize that this guy's a totally loose cannon, and they've got to do something about Schultz. And if that means actually protecting Thomas Dewey, then they're willing to do it.
Eric Desenhall.
When Dutch Schultz leaves the room, the commission knows they have a problem, and they know what the solution is. And the solution is to kill Dutch Schultz.
Having dared to question the authority of the commission, Schultz had signed his own death warrant. October 23rd, 1935. Schultz was at his favorite restaurant, the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey.
Well, the Palace Chop House, was a location where Dutch Schultz sort of set up his headquarters because he couldn't return to Manhattan because the mayor was threatening to arrest him if he set foot in the city. Dutch Schultz at this time still had pretty good control of his rackets. Like, he was still making a fair amount of money, still running the numbers racket. So he turned this Palace Chop House restaurant into his sort of headquarters. He would meet with his henchmen. They would go over various things. They would have their meals. And this is sort of where they hung out. And this was sort of became known in gangster circles. A lot of more cautious gangsters will eat in a different restaurant every night, change their schedule. Schultz didn't. He just picked the same place, and they would have often the same meal, steak and fries, and meet with the same people. So his enemies knew this and plotted an assassination.
Dutch left his table to go to the bathroom. Moments later, hitmen Charlie the Bug Workman and Mendy Weiss walked in.
Dutch Schultz is in the bathroom at the Chop House when two assassins burst into the restaurant. Charlie the Bug Workman and Mendy Weiss. And they come in with guns blazing.
Thomas Repetto.
The gunman came in and began firing. Some of the guys who were with him were shot 6 times.
But the killers couldn't find the man they'd come for.
The killers didn't know exactly where Dutch was. And they went into the bathroom, and Dutch was there, and so they just blasted him.
The two assassins made their escape as Dutch emerged from the bathroom.
Schultz stumbles over to a table, sits down hard as if he was drunk, and then splays his face and arms on the table. He's still wearing his fedora and his overcoat. This photograph of this becomes a gangster classic.
But Schultz wasn't dead.
Schultz is still alive at this point, as are the 3 other associates who've also been shot. So as far as a gangland hit goes, this was actually a very sloppy one.
Schultz was rushed to the hospital. Clinging to life, he would soon learn just how few friends he had left in the mob.
So Dutch Schultz is in the hospital, and he receives a telegram. This is not a telegram from one of his friends wishing him well. This is a telegram from one of the people he pushed aside when he took over the Harlem numbers racket. The telegram comes from a female gangster named Stephanie St. Clair, nicknamed Queenie, and the telegram says, "As you shall sow, so you shall reap." In other words, what you put out is what you get back. You've used violence to take over this racket, and this violence is now coming back to you.
On October 24th, 1935, Dutch Schultz dies. He is 34 years old.
Schultz is a very unusual gangster, so it's not a surprise that his death is rather unusual. He also takes hours to die. He runs an incredibly high fever, and he starts babbling. Police install a stenographer next to him to take down his words, thinking he might reveal some gangster secrets, and all he does is babble incoherently about this, that, and the other, and it sort of exemplifies his life, that he's always been this oddball character, and he ends his life in this oddball monologue that just goes on and on and on about, mother, save me, blah, blah, blah. And this sort of bizarre sort of soliloquy that ends his life. That he doesn't end it in some blaze of glory with a shootout with police or something, but he ends it lying on this bed, babbling incoherently and making absolutely no sense at all, which is kind of how a lot of his peers viewed him while he was alive.
Luciano and the commission met after Schultz's death to quietly divide up his empire.
The immediate beneficiary of Schultz's death is Lucky Luciano, because he's the unofficial head of the organized crime in United States. His peers, they sort of carve up Schultz's empire, and Lucky Luciano helps himself to a nice big portion.
Dutch had lost everything because he didn't see how the mob was changing.
Dutch Schultz was hated not only because he had no sense of style, he was hated because he was unpredictable. And the thing that these guys did not want at that time in history was somebody who would end up killing them. You wanted to believe you were in business with a partner, not somebody who would wake up on the wrong side of the bed and the next thing you know, put a bullet in you.
Dutch Schultz was too much of a loner, too public, too dangerous. In the end, he was simply bad for business.
Dutch was wild and defiant and killed, without even thinking.
Dutch Schultz's fatal flaw is that he never grew up, he never matured. That unlike his peers, and especially unlike Lucky Luciano, he never grew into the sort of slightly more mature, far-seeking kind of gangster who realizes, that there's certain unwritten rules, I can't be personally violent, I've got to sort of fall back into the shadows a bit. That Schultz really is the same personality when he dies as he was when he was 18, 19.
Dutch Schultz was the last mob boss to think that he alone could stand up to the might of Lucky Luciano and the American Mafia. And he paid the ultimate price.
This has been an Audio Boom original. Thanks to Hims, ZipRecruiter, and Dollar Shave Club for sponsoring this episode. Follow Mafia on Spotify, or rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find your favorite shows.